Welcome to class, everybody. Let's get started. I'd like to have a couple people introduce themselves like we did last time. Anybody care to do it without me calling on them?
I can.
Okay, great, thank you.
So my name is Rebecca Anderson. I'm a mechanical engineer. Taking classes at BYU. This is my senior year, and it's pretty excited for this class. I like to draw and read a lot of novels, and I love difficult things. I took heat transfer before fluid dynamics, and it was definitely hard, but I enjoyed the difficulty. So yeah.
Great. So you're not going to be able to leave this class alone.
Exactly.
Good. Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, anybody else care to introduce themselves?
I can introduce myself, Mike.
Thanks, Lindsay.
So my name is Lindsay Peterson. I have a background in mathematics, but my title is mechanical engineer. Although I think simulation analyst is probably a little bit better description of what I do at Kansas City. I can't remember if I said that I work in industry at KCNSC, our national security campus, and a lot of the work that I do involves supporting analysts' needs within our company. It's more of a role that I've developed here, and finding ways to make simulations easier and more understandable to our group here. So that kind of involves getting a better, well-rounded education in FEA, but then also exploring a little bit of the benefits that U-splines, have to offer as well.
Thanks, Lindsay. Maybe like two more. Anybody else care to go? I don't think we've had anybody from INL. How about I pick on INL? Anybody care to introduce themselves from that group?
I can do that. So my name is Andrew Slaughter. I work at Idaho National Lab. I'm part of the Moose team, so it's a multi-physics finite element framework, and we are collaborating with Core Form, hopefully to improve both of our products.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on there, or starting to go on there. Okay, maybe one more person. How about Ian?
Bacon?
Ian Bacon, yes.
So just kind of like introduction, like what I'm doing, or?
Yeah.
All right. So my name's Ian Bacon. I'm from Austin, Texas. I did my undergraduate work there at the University of Texas at Austin, with my focus being applied mathematics and physics. And while I was there, I did a little bit of work in the calculus of variations with one of my professors there. And then I went on a 2-year mission to Idaho and Oregon, and then just got back last year, and I'm doing my graduate work with Dr. Sommerfeld in the acoustics department, where we're coming up with a vibration method to obtain sound power from structures so that we can find ways to make them more quiet, to reduce the sound levels, to reduce hearing loss. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian.
Funny coincidence, Ian took over my work from my master's. So.
Yeah, Caleb passed the baton.
Yeah, we've had several people come from that group that are at Core Form. Okay, I wanted to make you guys aware, let me share my screen. Just a couple of things. One of the things that might be nice is if you'd like to present a seminar style lecture on a Friday during class, I'd welcome that. It's nice to be able to see what people are actually doing with these methods. We've got a good representation across the Department of Energy in particular. We have some good industry representation. So if you notice on the front page of our, where the syllabus is listed at research.coreform.com, Raytheon is going to present in November. So if you feel like you'd like to present some of your work at some point during the semester, just shoot me an email and we can find a Friday for you to present. In particular, especially with the DOE sites, this is a good opportunity for you to recruit our awesome BYU students who go to the DOE sites in droves during the summer. So there's a lot of activity there, and maybe a nice way for you to get new talent, fresh blood. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention was, for those of you who are doing homework, don't forget about forum.coreform.com. People are starting to use it and ask their questions there. And it's a nice place for us to answer them, because then they're recorded and available to everybody. So I'd like the first stop for questions to be the forum, and we're monitoring it constantly, so that there'll be a pretty quick turnaround on questions. Okay, any other things that you are curious about, questions you'd like me to address before I dive in?
Mike, I think you should have a material modeler talk, because it's like the hardest part that you're not prepared for when you hit industry of FEA.
Is there somebody that you are either volunteering, or are you volunteering yourself?
I mean, I can talk about some of the things I've done, but they're like just dipping the toe in the water, but I could find people probably.
Yeah, it's okay. We just want to kind of probably draw from the group that we've got in the class, but unless you can find somebody who's anxious to present. Okay, let's dive back into where we were. See if we can finish this up today. Okay. All right, so let's see if you can. Okay, great. Can you see my desktop now?
Yep.
Yes.
So we were talking at the end of the class, we had a good discussion about these systems of equations, and we were talking about, in particular, the mass matrix and how to interpret these linear systems. In this case, you have the mass matrix and the difference between what we call the column space and the row space. And I'm going to get into that a little more in a bit, but that this picture is really a nice, what I would call a mental model to kind of have in your back pocket when it comes to these kinds of numerical methods that generate large linear systems. So mass matrix is entries coming from this bilinear form here for all the different combinations of the basis functions. And then this guy here, we call the force vector, is another, it's really what you would call a dot product, where we're projecting the function f in the direction of each NA. That's how you interpret what's going on here. Okay, now let's go through a few little implementation aspects that may not be immediately obvious if you haven't done this kind of work before. So we've got integrals primarily that we're dealing with. And the question then becomes, what is the appropriate integration domain over which to evaluate integrands and integrals? The finite element method, even in the name, it gives you some hints that there's something about standardization going on in the method, which means we're going to have a very complicated object and we're going to try and simplify it down to a canonical finite element and perform most of our mathematical operations over that element. And we kind of repeat that computation over and over and over again. That's one of the positive aspects of the method, is that it simplifies computations in that way. And so this idea of doing a change of variables on integrals becomes central to the method. So let's just review this. Remember, for this integral, we started with an integral over some physical domain of, this is where we actually are solving the problem, omega. And then we have NA of, let's say, x, NB of x, d omega. But for the purposes of our conversation, let's assume that this is not, in some sense, our finite element domain or a natural domain for integration. And in fact, in the literature, finite elements, we often call this change of variables operation, where we introduce a different coordinate system and a different domain for the purposes of integration. We call this a natural or a parent domain. Okay, and so even though in this example, there's some simplifications that make it somewhat trivial, this is an important, I would say, thing to understand because we're going to see it again and again. So in this case, we're doing a change of variables. We call our new domain omega bar. And maybe I'll rewrite this. We have omega bar. We have some change of variables function. Let's call it x of xc. And then everywhere that you see an x, you replace it with x of xc. Okay, and then we have to change this differential term to be in terms of d omega bar. And the way we do that is we introduce what's called a Jacobian, which measures the scaling of area or volume between the different domains of integration. In 1D, the Jacobian is nothing more than dx dxc. Let me go d omega bar. Okay, so basically what we've done, let's draw a schematic, is we have, let's say, some domain, omega. This is what we're going to call our physical domain. And it's where we're solving the problem. Sometimes we also use the term computational domain. And what we're saying is that there exists some function, we're calling it x of xc, that takes omega bar. Okay, and so let's take a point up here in omega, we're denoting by x. This we call a coordinate. Okay, so the coordinate for the physical domain omega, we're using the term x. The coordinate we're using here is xc. And so that's why we call this a change of variables or a change of coordinates. Now these coordinates are measured with respect to some system. So we call it a coordinate system. So let's say there's a coordinate system that looks maybe like this, and we use these arrows to denote essentially the orientation of a basis for the space. In this case, we have kind of our canonical basis. And so x is measured with respect to this coordinate system. And so a coordinate system is a way of labeling all the points in a particular domain. Okay, so depending on the system that you choose, these labels will change because they depend on the system that you choose. Same thing down here. We assume there's some coordinate system. We're using xc. Maybe the y-axis will use eta. Okay, and if this is a two-dimensional domain, which it's not yet, if it was though, these coordinates would be 0.6c eta. We don't need to worry about that yet because we haven't done any two-dimensional things. Okay, so in finite elements, really the flavor of the method says in FEA, what we're going to assume about omega is maybe it's not a blob like an arbitrary shape, maybe it's something like that or that, right? Some canonical domain, parent or natural domain. And then this change of coordinates function takes us from these simple domains into some very arbitrary physical domain. And so the reason that we're changing integrals back into these domains is because then it makes it simple to do things like quadrature, for example, over these canonical domains. Okay, now I realize for many of you, maybe this is review. I would say that an understanding of what a coordinate is and a coordinate system is not, I would say, immediately obvious to most people if you don't work in this field. And the use of coordinate systems is something that's also important to emphasize again and again. Okay, so so we have an integral now that goes, like I say, from omega n a n b functions of x d omega to a new integral omega bar n a x of xc and b x of xc. Then there's some scaling we call the Jacobian. In this case, it's dx dxc d omega. So we call this thing in general, in 1D it's kind of trivial, but in general we call it a Jacobian. Okay, and it will be in the form of a matrix, and we'll take the determinant of that matrix to determine the scaling. Okay, so now we're in in some sense, our parent or natural domain, omega bar. So let's transition now to quadrature, which means that this integral, everywhere you see the integration symbol, you're going to replace it with a summation. actually, let me say, before I dive into that, let me say one thing about the change of coordinates or change of variables. Notice that this function here, I have not defined it. Let's talk a little bit about, this is deep water here. Deep water. This function. Let's talk a little bit about it. How do we, maybe from your own experience using finite elements or other kinds of methods, or just thinking about this, what might be, how might we define this function? Any thoughts?
Kind of like parametrizing.
Yeah, so yeah, it is a parameter. Yeah, I should say another way that, another thing that people call this is, especially if you know about differential geometry, this would actually be called mathematically a parametrization, meaning that we've introduced some new parameters, xc, that somehow have helped us define our domain x or omega. But this question here is interesting to me. How do you define that? Well, the answer is any way you want, as long as it works. Is that a good answer? Any way you want as long as it works, meaning that there isn't a canonical way that these mappings are created. You know, if you go into the mathematical literature, they almost always restrict these mappings to affine mappings, which basically means, you know, you take a square and you just go to some skewed object. These lines stay lines, right? In spline-based methods, our mappings are much more complicated and they have all kinds of different flavors, because another way to think about this, let's see if I want to clear all my drawings. So another way to think about this, I don't know if it's a big leap or not, but and maybe this is the most appropriate term for this mapping: geometry. It is the geometry of the problem. So in the context of geometry, how do we incorporate geometry into any kind of digital system? Well, we often will use things like a mesh is a type of geometry. We use the term CAD as a type of geometry, and a CAD, of course, is an umbrella term for a lot of different things that we'll talk about. So there are various options. They all have pluses and minuses. But what I want to make sure that you understand is that this function, there's nothing sacred about it. You do whatever you need to, you pick whatever the best one is for the problem class that you're considered to be doing. Let me make a mention of what I would say is the dominant approach in classical FEA, at least. Anybody know what it's called off the top of their head? Any of you practitioners of finite elements who are using it or developing methods? What's the what is the canonical way that this guy is normally defined? We call it isoparametric mappings. An isoparametric mapping means if your displacement, so if we come over to, I'm going to erase this now. If we come over to the lecture notes, we scroll up, what we notice is our solution that we're searching for, this U, this is the guy we're searching for. Notice that it's written in terms of some coefficients times some basis functions. Okay, so we have that. So we've got this. So maybe we could do something like this. So we have U, H of XC is equal to D, A, N, A of XC. That's fine. Why don't we do this? Seems convenient, right? Because we already have these basis functions defined and hanging around, and we're going to use them to define our solution, right? Remember, we're looking for a solution in some space. The space is spanned by these basis functions. Well, why don't we use the same space, same basis functions to represent our geometry? Except rather than computing, like for these are our unknown degrees of freedom, we're going to compute those guys. Why don't we just directly specify these guys? Okay, and this approach is called an isoparametric mapping. Isoparametric mapping. And it means define solution space VH, and then what you do is you enforce that X is in VH. That's basically what an isoparametric, and this is also called isoparametric finite elements. I'm sure some of you have heard that term before, isoparametric finite elements, but that's what it means. Okay, so notice that there's an order in the way things are defined. In an isoparametric finite element setting, which is like 99% of commercial finite elements, we do this first, this second. We define the solution space and our basis, and then we figure out how to represent the geometry in terms of that space.
So am I just like intuitively, is this meaning like if you have a 3D object, you want to define a 3D space? Or does that have anything to do with it? Like you don't want a 2D space to map a 2D object? I mean, to map a 3D object, or is that not? When we say VH, does that H?
VH is defined in the notes. It is just the linear space, the finite element space, the finite dimensional space that
Right.
we're using to where we're going to look for our solutions.
Right.
So maybe.
Okay. And so you're saying, yeah, so you're just saying that they have to match.
That's right. That in an isoparametric setting, you define your solution space and then build a geometry for your problem that lives in that space, right? It's defined as a linear combination of the basis functions that span that space. So what's this workflow? What's the workflow then? Like if you were to build a finite element model, the workflow actually is defined by the mathematics in this case. So what do you start with? Like if you're an engineer, what are you given before you can do anything with finite elements? Like what's
A drawing.
a drawing or some like CAD, right? So you have a CAD
Yeah.
object that comes in, and then what do you do with the CAD object before you can run a simulation?
You mesh it.
You mesh it. Okay, now I want you guys to become maybe a little more sophisticated.
Or you clean up the geometry.
This meshing process, what it's doing simultaneously, unbeknownst maybe to many, is the first thing it's doing is constructing VH, right? The mesh is the discrete object over which you're going to define these NAs, okay? So when you pick an element type, you're picking a VH. Okay, so
element type and mesh decomposition.
yes, so you're picking an element type and then how those elements cover the CAD object. Okay. Then the second thing that it's doing is you prescribe what we call nodal locations, right? Nodes. The nodes are the XAs.
Are the nodes the XAs or the integration points?
No, nodes are the XAs.
Okay.
Integration points, we'll get to that in a minute. It's a different set of points, but that's
because typically when you build a mesh, if you've given it your discretization, the nodes are already in there.
the nodes come
They're
through
not-
the meshing process, right? The meshing process creates the mesh, the topology of the mesh, as well as the nodal locations.
Right. They happen at the same time.
It might be
They happen at the same
semantics.
time,
Yeah.
Eric, because
Yeah, they
because
happen
they're
at the same time.
isogeometric.
Well, typically they're putting nodes on the geometry first, and then they're filling it with a mesh.
Yeah,
But,
that doesn't matter.
yeah,
I mean,
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't change this picture at all.
Okay.
So but the important point from somebody who just uses finite element software to somebody who really understands what's going on is that when someone says a mesh, you should now start thinking this, right? Like, okay, I'm constructing my discrete space. I'm defining some notion of geometry. Okay, now what's weird, I hope you can see something that's weird in this workflow. Don't we already have a geometry? Isn't CAD geometry? Somebody answer that. I mean, you've got somebody spending all kinds of time and money building beautiful CAD models, and then I'm telling you that I give you a CAD model and then we build a geometry.
Well, it's not rigorous.
Isn't the CAD model that's like your supposedly like exact geometry versus a mesh is your discretized geometry, so in the finite element space.
Okay, so why don't we say that, so the CAD is going to give us a mapping, a parameterization. Let's call it X of, you know, just how we're using X up here. Let's call this X FEA. Let's call this X CAD. X, and this is going to give us our mapping X FEA. Okay, so we have, so CAD, it gives us it actually gives us a function X of CAD. That's in CAD. I mean, it's there. And then FEA gives us another geometry Okay, and what Lindsay is pointing out is that they are not equal, right? What normally happens to this X FEA? In what ways is it not equal to the geometry coming from the CAD?
Well, so in
One
3D
way
problems,
that-
CAD's only a boundary representation where you need a volumetric mesh.
Okay. Yeah, so this guy's what I would call fit for purpose for design. And so what Ryan is saying is that even a solid model is not solid. It's just a solid encapsulated by surfaces, right? From a CAD perspective, there's no such thing as what we call a three-dimensional parameterization. Whereas in FEA, if we have a solid element, we assume it's solid, meaning you can actually define fields on the interior of the element, which you can't in the CAD object.
To one of Eric's points earlier is that often the CAD that we receive, we have to simplify or defeature.
Yep, so we change it because maybe maybe our problem dictates that we don't need as much detail as the CAD model has. And so there's a good engineering reason to simplify it.
Well, and also, so like if you're picking your mesh type, occasionally certain mesh types are incompatible with certain shapes.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So now all of a sudden the robustness of the process of putting a mesh on a CAD object is starting to dictate to the analyst the possible set of X FEAs that are allowable, right? That you can actually construct. And so you often simplify a model not because of some engineering assumptions or good engineering judgment, but simply because you can't get a mesh on the original CAD object. Okay.
Is another difference just that I mean, you've just essentially taken some points on the surface of the CAD and thrown everything else away and then interpolated between the points.
Exactly right. Yep. So you basically sampled the CAD to generate a new description that only has the information coming from those discrete set of points. Okay, so this is the implications of what we call, I would say, classical, because it's so dominant. In industry, this is 99.9% of FEA is isoparametric FEA. And this decision, we almost forgot to talk about it, right? This X and DX, DXC, it seems innocuous, but in fact, it dictates so much about what happens in FEA, in the sense that it dramatically, it kind of implies certain workflows for better or for worse. And so after you mesh, then you go to simulation, right? You actually run the problem. Okay, so another mathematical way of thinking about this is, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we instead flip it on its head and say that X sub CAD let's assume that this is given to us first, okay? And then let's set X FEA simply equal to X CAD. So we take the CAD directly, as our description of geometry, or a change of coordinates function, or however you want to call it. And then u h of c is written in terms of these guys here, right? So let's call these CAD maybe. Okay, this is a different math, and these are well-defined. This is a well-defined mathematical thing that I'm describing. I mean, I don't know every single detail, but this is called an isogeometric method. So you probably have heard that term. I'm sure if you're in this class, you've heard that term. But isogeometric is a play on, historically, it's a play on isoparametric. That's where the name comes from. And it's a play on this concept, this well-defined mathematical idea in terms of the mappings themselves. Okay, let's talk about implications here, because there are some positive and negative implications. Let's start with the question about VH. What about VH? Where does VH come from? How am I going to define my solution space in an isogeometric method?
Oh, it depends on what the space is for CAD, right?
Yeah, so the people that design the CAD systems, do they care about solution spaces? What do you think?
No.
No.
They're primarily concerned with just shape representation, right? And so these functions that are being used here to represent XCAD, they may or may not even be a basis for a space. You don't know usually ahead of time whether you're even going to get a basis that gives you some well-defined VH. That is an open question. Okay. So maybe, so there's a couple of options here. Maybe we do this. Okay. So we take the CAD mapping, okay, which is fine. That's a mapping we can still use. We neglect the basis because maybe it doesn't span a space we're interested in. We adopt the exact geometry, but now we still build our own basis that gives us a good approximation space. What would we call this? Well, I don't even know what we would call this because this hasn't been defined in the literature yet, right? So, but isogeometric methods actually have these two flavors, right? Where they have, and my students and anybody at core form, we need to define what these are the two dominant pictures, the actual mathematical description of these two pictures, and we need to come up with a name for them. So the first,
is this just basically NURBS based IGA and then other spline type IGA? Is that?
Yeah. So the first one where the set of functions NA CAD, span in a rigorous way some VH. The term that we are using currently for this is we normally call this analysis, where the CAD, we call this analysis suitable CAD, meaning that we've controlled the CAD operation such that we know that the resulting parameterization and basis is suitable for simulation. Okay, that gives really high quality results, but it's a little restrictive. This other one, right, where we say X FEA is equal to X CAD, and then we build our own basis. Somehow this is kind of nice because then any CAD can work. In other words, we can use any CAD object and run a simulation directly on that CAD. And the term that we use for this currently is a flex. It's called, we call it at least the flex representation method. Meaning there's some flexibility because you have removed the constraint that these guys have to span some well-defined solution space, but you're still using the exact CAD geometry in the simulation. Okay, and so these are both of these methods fall under the umbrella of isogeometric finite elements, but the field is still so young that these two methods we're still in the process of defining them rigorously. And so many of the people on this call today will be the ones who define these methods for future generations, right? So, but this is, so from industry, you industry folks, which one do you think is more appealing to you and why?
The one that works, because I need something that works right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good, that's the right sentiment, right? And so what, one or two? What do you think, Eric?
I think one would work the best, just because if I had a system that could define it within the space that I needed, then I can make sure that it's going to work with my current mesh.
Okay.
And with my solver as it is right now.
Okay,
I think that's the caveat.
I agree with everything that you said. With the caveat, though, that means we have to redefine CAD.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the big restriction. We have to redefine the world of the industry of CAD. Otherwise, I totally agree with Eric. Problem is I don't believe that's going to happen. So that's a huge constraint on this method, right? Because then you're essentially, you're building, you have to build an analysis suitable version of your CAD, which is fine. For many purposes, it'll give you such tremendous benefits, it'll be worth it. But what are the implications of number two?
You have to redefine your FEA.
Well, couldn't we just do this though, in this case? So there's the CAD. And then this is the mesh that creates VH. All of a sudden, wow, it's really easy to, is this a hard mesh to create a box? No, we can do that automatically, right? There's no relationship now between the solution space and the geometry. And so all of a sudden, we can take any CAD geometry and build solution spaces that don't even have to conform to the CAD themselves. That's what this picture, this number two subsumes these kinds of approaches. Or you could have your original CAD and then maybe you have some other CAD over the top of it. Whatever you want to do. That's why we call it a flex representation method. Another term that's used is immersed, although it's more than immersed. Immersed generally is the one where you put everything in a box. That's fine, but it's not necessarily what has to, it can be more general than that.
So these things, they map basically onto what Hughes calls global and local, right? Like,
I haven't introduced that in the class yet. I know what you're talking about, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
Mike, show us how this, when you go to immerse this functional analysis view, how do your shape functions relate to your XCAD now?
Remember, they don't have to. I mean, look, even in the simplest 1D, in the simplest 1D setting, look, they don't have to. It's just a change of coordinates. You don't have to have a strong relationship between them.
So
this
angle,
this idea that there's this like tight coupling comes from the dominance of isoparametric methods, and it's something that's going away. I would imagine in the next 20 years of finite elements, this whole idea is going to be blown up. So because it imposes such strong constraints on the way you generate meshes and introduces so many bottlenecks that are so expensive, it just doesn't, it's going to die. It already is dying slowly.
So the question I would have is why did they go that way in the first place? I mean,
because they didn't have CAD. CAD didn't exist when they defined isoparametric finite elements. Like CAD systems came about in the 80s, and they were doing isoparametric finite elements in the 60s and 70s. So they defined a paradigm independent of the CAD community, and then they've kind of force fit the two communities together over time. But the roots of those communities are in totally different sets of constraints. So in the old days, you know, you'd have a drawing and you'd manually place your nodes, right, and connect the dots. And
yeah, I mean, I've used that software back when I was in the aerospace industry.
Yeah,
and you know, I've built it that way, and that's why I kind of said, well, number one, because if you go back to the way they did it, you know, in the 60s and 70s, well, that's what you did, and you're building that mesh exactly how you wanted to solve it. And then they created this new methodology for creating geometry. But so there are techniques that do that, like what you're saying, kind of an immersed method. They use that for fluid dynamics and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of methods like this.
But why is it that they didn't use those methods for solid mechanics?
Because they're not accurate if you use linear finite elements. You need the higher order smooth splines to make the flexible representation method work at a high level of accuracy.
And we're starting to see this even penetrate a little bit in linear solid mechanics, right? With Discovery Live, and
yeah, but the same problem still remains, that they're not as accurate.
Yeah, and so this is what we're going to talk about in this class, is that you can build methods like this with arbitrarily high order robust splines, and you get fantastic results, far better than linear FEA. So it's changing the entire, what's happening is the introduction of smooth higher order splines and all of the sophisticated techniques that we now have for imposing boundary value problems over these grids. We can essentially eliminate any source of error by manipulating the spline space, whether it's body fitted or not.
Yeah, but so the question that I have a follow-up on that is, yes, I understand that the smooth space spline can fit this geometry more accurately.
We don't try to fit the geometry. You don't even have to fit the geometry, and you can still get accurate solutions. That's what I'm saying.
Well, the spline has to represent the geometry.
No, it doesn't. That's the point of
the solution space, though.
I mean, if you're not representing the actual geometry in any way, then how do you know that there's stress on a corner if that corner doesn't ever exist in any representation?
You incorporate the exact CAD, but it has nothing to do with your solution space, is what I'm saying. And so solution space can have a geometry that has nothing to do with the CAD, and it doesn't have to be what we call body fitted. And the power of the spline, theoretically, is that you can still recover, you know, stress concentrations and all the things that you would be interested in body fitted linear FEA when it's not body fitted with greater accuracy. That's the point.
Okay, but then can the codes that are being implemented right now utilize this methodology of basically not fitting the CAD at all?
Not really. They're all like 30, 40 years old and built on like pretty old stuff. So it's going to be a disruptor that disrupts this.
So at the end of the day, there will be a necessary solver created that can execute this mathematics that doesn't yet exist.
This is on the commercial side of my life. This is what Coreform's all about. This is essentially what in the isogeometric community, this is what has evolved, what has emerged as what we've learned over the last 15 years investigating smooth splines is exactly, I'm giving you a snapshot of where we're at today. So the next generation of solvers will most likely take advantage of this. There's no real reason not to. And there's so many positive upsides.
That's pretty amazing. Is there, so for some intuition on this, is it like if you were to put stresses on parts of a box, and then once you had those results, you cut out a geometry from that box that looks like yours and see what's on?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And what I'm saying is, even though we're approximating stress on a box that doesn't fit the geometry, because the geometric map is present in the simulation and we have the power of the splines, we can still resolve it to high accuracy, even if it's not fitted to the geometry.
Mike, what's going to be the robustness limit on this?
Well, robustness, I guess, depends on we can end for those of you who are wondering if we're done, we're done. We're just talking now. So feel free to, you're not going to miss any more content.
So Dr. Scott, I think an important point is that it's not, you're not limited to one or the other. You can pick and choose and build it. There's an entire spectrum between everything. Like you don't have to choose one and eliminate the other option. Like you have
part of your model could be body fitted, and then it can transition into a non-body fitted regime. All the methods that I'm going to present in this class are completely generic. They will work no matter what method you pick. So this idea that you have to, it's one or the other, that's gone.
Also, Dr. Scott, at Coreform, we can do the second formulation using body fitted mesh, right?
Yeah, that's right. Number 2 subsumes both body fitted.
Body fitted one.
Yeah, and these other more flexible schemes. That's exactly right. So what I'm going to, I mean, that's the purpose of this course, is I'm just going to present the whole finite element world from this point of view and act like it's always existed. So that's the challenge that's in front of us.
So Mike, when you have a body fitted, your robustness limit is mainly doing that Jacobian mapping, right? But in this case,
well, Curtis, robustness is there's much more to that. It's a function of the method. It's a function of the physics. It's a function.
Well, I'm talking in terms of your deformation gradient.
Well, in this case, this will be a lot better because you can control that a lot better if you don't have to fit this mesh to the geometry. You can always start with elements that are really nicely shaped, and their deformation, you already get much superior deformation characteristics with higher order splines, linear FEA, but this will give you even more of that.
So if I can ask a follow-up question, where you would put a like a force, right? Let's say you want to put a force on a point that's sitting in the middle of this box. Usually with analysis I've seen, and which is very limited, you put it somewhere like on the surface. Whereas here, would you still put it on the surface in terms of like the surface of that box, or can you put it anywhere inside that box?
You just put it directly on the CAD in this case, in that case. And so we enforce all boundary conditions in a weak sense if necessary. And so we can incorporate, we'll go through all this stuff, how you do this.
Just for some clarification on my end, are the elements with this solution space you're making, do they get mapped onto the geometry, or is it solved completely separately and the results get mapped to it based on where the geometry is?
Yeah, there you go. The second, it can be all of the above. In other words, you can do anything you want with that geometric mapping, whatever is most convenient for the workflow that you need to implement. You know, like if you need to make meshing easier, then pick a mapping that makes meshing easier. You know, if you need really, really tight accuracy, well, maybe on part of your model, then make part of it really a nice, beautiful mesh, and then the rest of it, don't worry about whether you fit to the geometry.
Thank you.
The point is as soon as you conceptually break free from thinking that there's this requirement on how the mapping relates to the method, and you know how to do it generically, then all of a sudden you have a method that encapsulates all of that stuff in one. You can write one solver, you know, that does all of these operations.
Yeah. So you could have like a wing sticking out that's meshed perfectly and all this stuff, super refined, just connected to a big box around the rest of your airplane or something.
Yep.
This just makes like your global elements easy, and you can still do like find local seeds wherever you want and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and so the purpose of this course is to develop rigorously all of these ideas. So this is what the purpose is to go through everything from this different isogeometric spline-based vantage point and redefine everything, right? How do you do this, you know? So
yeah, there's some really cool stuff there that I think needs to be said. I'm just thinking about my videos now. All right, thanks so much.
Just like curiosity, or go ahead, Zach.
Oh, this might be a philosophical question, but like it seems like there's a symmetry, like in the same way that U-splines are a generalization of NURBS and T-splines, like they're special cases of U-splines. It seems like you're kind of saying this is a generalization of the finite element method.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's
Right.
exactly what I'm saying.
Is there a connection between the fact that U-splines are a generalization of splines and this being, that's what I'm...
No, not really.
Okay.
Yeah, they're two different ideas.
All right.
Now, Mike, there are other games in town for this point of view, right? Like some of the particle methods are similar to this.
Oh yeah, I mean, people have developed a lot of methods to try and overcome the constraint of meshing, for sure. The reason that we think now is the time is that it's all about the higher order smoothness that makes these things go.
You ready?
Okay.
So Zach, just a comment on just on your question, is that in general, when you can take mathematics and make it more general, like generalization of mathematics oftentimes gives you more power and flexibility. And so, right. I mean, it's not as, you know, as Dr. Scott said, it's not the exact same thing, but that's kind of the approach that U-splines took, was to generalize a field of mathematics, and then this flex representation method is a generalization of traditional finite element mathematics.
Right, okay.
Well, thanks everybody. Let's stop here.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, we'll see you.